Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tracy Markey. As Rolf mentioned, I'm the chairman of Lawnmark International Trade Association. So first of all, thank you for coming and attending our sessions here today. I've been not in all of them, but in a fair number of them, and I'm pleasantly surprised and pleased with the attendance. So we really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to do that. This afternoon's subject is about cybersecurity. And it's really meant to be kind of a higher level overview. Corey is going to follow me. Corey has a lot more experience in the business aspect of what happens and what are the problems with cybersecurity attacks and what goes on at companies when this happens. I'm going to do a little bit more of the setup and kind of a higher level take at this. But before I get started, I wanted to see how many of you here would say you're pretty versed and expert in cybersecurity. These are the guys I'm going to watch for nodding off because this is going to be a little basic for you guys, perhaps. So the rest of it, though, I want to try to introduce this in particular and why is this such an important subject right now. It was interesting for me to notice when I looked through all of the educational sessions, there were only two that talked about cybersecurity. One happened this morning across the way with the BACnet SC stuff, with a panel of just amazingly educated and experienced experts talking about what's going on in that world. So I sat through some of that today and I found that extremely interesting. And then our session here. So the first thing I wanted to do today when I kind of saw this unfolding was talk a little bit about just what's going on. So just so you know who I am, my day job, I'm not a paid employee or anything of Lawnmark. This is a volunteer position. So my day job, I do have a couple of companies actually that are in this industry. Ingenuity, I don't know if anyone here has heard of Ingenuity Systems. We've been around for 25 years as a controls distributor. We're the first company to have an online shop, even for purchasing controls, sensors, actuators, and so forth. But we've been kind of in an interesting place in the middle between manufacturers and end users and having to field and understand and work with both sides of that equation, right? Because the problems and challenges are different if you're a manufacturer compared to if you're a building owner, for instance. So we've really had the opportunity over these decades to see both sides of this. So it's kind of given us an interesting perspective on this whole thing. The thing that I think is most important in this industry, I've been coming and doing the ASHRAE for 20 years or something like that, I think. And it was interesting, you know, I always try to start out with a question or understand who the audience is a little bit. And one of the questions I used to ask when we first started this is, how many of you have cell phones? Right? That's kind of a ridiculous question now. But that morphed eventually into maybe, you know, 7 years ago, how many of you are connecting your buildings or control systems to the internet? And initially there's a hand or two, and then there's half the audience. And now that feels a little like a ridiculous question too, because everything's getting connected one way or another, right? But the key point there is the world is changing. And the big change that we've all been seeing and experiencing, if you're in this industry at all, is that the architectures of the systems are changing, the business models surrounding controls and how we do business is changing. And more importantly, maybe than anything, is the mindset is changing, both of the customer side of it and the manufacturer side of it. We are seeing companies that have never been in our industry enter into the industry. And, you know, we've seen that over the years. They come and go. And, you know, there's the whole IP to every device that kind of came and went for a while. Now it's back again. And there are a bunch of new players entering. When I'm amazed coming here every year and as entrenched as we are in the market, how many companies I don't recognize when I walk the floor out there. So there are definitely new entrants all the time. And there are companies who are getting out of our business, or they're changing, or they're evolving. You know, there's been a big announcement, and some of the big guys who have announced, you know, we're getting out of the hardware business. We're just going to be software, which if you were to ever say that 10 years ago or 15 years ago, no one would have thought you were serious or would have believed you, right? So things are really changing from that. And a lot of this is created kind of by what I call this perfect storm. We've got this ubiquitous computing available everywhere. You can buy, my phone has more processing power, more memory, more storage than the original shuttle by orders of magnitude, not by a little bit, right? So you could have flown, a dozen shuttles off the power that we carry around in our hands now. So this availability of computing so cheaply has been a key factor. Pervasiveness of connectivity. How long ago, it wasn't many years ago, where trying to find a Wi-Fi signal or trying to get a good cell signal, especially one that had data capability to do email, we were always walking around and trying to find the best place in the building to stand. So now that's getting less and less. It's still not perfect, but it's less and less. And part of what's made that so important is the price of that connectivity has dropped so far. And then finally, acceptance, right? There was, as every technology, there's a learning curve and an adoption curve that is associated with it. And initially, a lot of technologies get met with fear. What's going to happen with my data? Is everybody going to be able to, and it's still there, obviously, hack my TV and see what's going on or what I'm watching or my camera on my laptop or whatever it might be. Those are still real concerns and real problems potentially. But in general, I think we could all agree that society has accepted the fact that things are connected, that we live in a networked world in one way or another, and why should buildings be any different than that, right? And it's not just a system in the building that's connected. Now we're talking about the lighting system, talking with the HVAC system, talking with the access control system, and this integration that is happening here over the past several years, especially, has become much, much more common and even written into specs at this point, where you never saw that before. But the problem with all of this is if we don't do something right now from a cybersecurity standpoint, it's going to be too late. Pandora's box is open, and if we don't figure out how to rally this in and get our arms around all of this now, the economists here, this is a little sad, 1 trillion connected computers and devices by 2035. That's another order of magnitude increase from where we are today. So everything is getting there. Some of the ridiculous things that you can buy that are smart and connected now, just amazing. A smart toothbrush and smart ashtrays and smart collection bins and, but when you stop and think, somebody built a business around that and had a use case for that and was able to fund it, believed in it, built it, and they're delivering it, right? So it's getting out there. So let me talk a little bit mindsets, because I think this might be, make sure I feel like I skipped something here. No, okay. Mindsets might be the most important part of this. So traditional mindset in the buildings world, as I came up through, was, we are the controls people. We do control systems for buildings. We stand alone. We don't have to worry about the IT guys. We don't care what lighting is doing. We don't even hardly know what the internet is. We just do a control system. And yeah, you know what? We've got smart enough. They're networked together, our devices, but pretty standalone islands of automation, you might call it. Very device-centric kind of thinking. From a reporting standpoint and information standpoint, a really good system had built-in canned reports, right? Show me the temperature, the alarm report, that's a common one. How many alarms have I had of what kind, in the past 24 hours or this month or whatever it might be. But it was a drop-down menu, click this report, that's what you got, right? And the good programs had some pretty good reporting built into them. I mentioned they may or may not be connected, but one thing that I think is pretty safe to say that, especially for the bigger buildings, one of the key components was controls knowledgeable people to run them, to understand the data, to understand what the reports are saying, to troubleshoot, to maintain, let alone install and get them all working properly, right? You had to have controls knowledge. So that was kind of the traditional way of thinking about the stuff. IoT, when you start talking to people who grew up in the IoT world, It's a little bit different, and it's that little bit of difference is what's really important here. So they're networked by definition, right? Internet of Things. So they start from the very moment of inspiration of what I'm going to do with the control system or building automation. It's all about networking. They're integrated. They have flexible architectures. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. Data is king. That's the key point. If you talk to somebody who lives not in our world, but in like a SaaS model or people who develop apps that collect information, it is all about the data. When Nest sold to Google, do you think Google paid billions of dollars for a really good-looking thermostat? That isn't what that's not what the value was it, for Nest? It was about the data they were collecting. And that's why Google wanted them. Why did Google want to own a thermostat company? Right? They want to know who's home, when are they home, what's going on, are they using things that way? So hosted UIs and databases. So another thing, and we still have a lot of that in kind of the traditional market, if you will. There's a database somewhere, there's a UI, often driven from a controller or a web server that's part of the control system on premise. It's self-contained. Database is, on a server somewhere on premise in the system. Not the case with the typical IoT system. It's all about pushing it out. Now, I will say that there is this pendulum swing in our industry. It's, centralized control, distributed control, cloud control, edge computing. It's just like, where are we putting the power and the storage? On-premise or some big centralized? Or back on, now we're back on premise or close to premise. Now we got fog computing, right? And that's somewhere in between the two of those things. So it's kind of interesting, but generally speaking, IoT is about cloud services, central databases, mixing lots of databases together. I don't have to have a outside air temp sensor or weather station on my building anymore, because I can subscribe to NOAA's weather feed and get all of that with my zip code attached to it, right? And then finally, analytics, and the important part of this is this kind of what I call a road to autonomy. So not that anyone thinks that they're going to be able to replace controls knowledgeable people, but man, if I can offload a lot of the basic crap from you guys, or having to take a report and interpret it for somebody who doesn't understand basics about controls and just take care of the problem, that makes our lives a whole lot easier, right? So they don't care about reports. Reports, it's like, reports, that's so 1990s. We're way past that. So it's all about what can we do for autonomy. I mean, think about self-driving cars, right? That's the biggest change in our generation that we're seeing. And I don't know if you know, but the first fully self-driving paid passenger happened in my hometown last October, right? By Waymo, the Google company. We've got these white vans that run all over Chandler, Arizona, where I live. I only drive 2 miles to work, and I see 3 of them every day, just in that 2 miles, all over the place. So autonomy, that's an important aspect of this whole thing. Click, come on, there we go. Architecture. On the left, the traditional architecture is tiered, structured. We've got the device layer, we've got an IP layer, we've got the user interface and that supervisory layer, and then more lately we kind of got this high level where we're pulling some buildings together maybe, and it kind of looks a little like IoT even, but still mentality is not that. It's structured, tiered architectures. IoT architectures, on the other hand, are anything but that. I've got 4 different systems in a building, and somebody hires me to integrate those all together and put them together however I can. Or I get some smart thermostats that are already talking to my cloud, then I add a bunch of temp sensors through a gateway, and now I push that to my cloud. And oh, by the way, I've got this smart light switch that can control all those lights over there, so we've got a little peer-to-peer going on. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's about, can I get it connected and can I share the information? And again, can I push the data up, right? So completely different architecture from that standpoint. And then the final thing I want to kind of talk about, just comparing the two, traditional model from a business standpoint, this is important for us to remember too, is CapEx, buy the equipment up front, get it installed. There's no subscription fees typically unless it's like a maintenance contract or something. Very often single vendor product, the whole control system might be supplied by a single vendor, or certainly at least installed by a single integrator installer. You will have lots of license-based devices. Sometimes it's on points or users, or we get even into geography and protected territories. That's kind of the typical model we all have lived with for quite a while. Competitive bid or design bid are kind of the normal procurement processes. On the IoT world, you may or may not get some of that, but their thinking is, how can I get somebody into a monthly recurring revenue model, right? How can I get them sending me a check, hitting their credit card every single month somehow? Well, to do that, they've got to provide ongoing value, which goes back to the analytics and autonomy. There's a lot of shared revenue models. You know, we've had performance contracting for a while, but this is a little bit different than that even. Subscriptions are where it's all about. Very non-territorial. If I'm an IoT company and I can't sell everywhere, and because I sell online anyway, and I can't sell all over the United States, this is not really an interesting thing for me to get into if I can only sell in my state or my city. You know, they're producing systems, they're not doing labor, right? Always multi-vendor, non-competitive. Which also means the threats are changing. So just a real quick primer here on this, but the four kind of basic categories of cybersecurity threats, and the problem is with everything I just said, the world is changing to that, and the one key thing is IoT systems are much more difficult to secure than a structured system with good definition and lots of protection, and physical access points are few. Now we're talking about every device is potentially talking in an open and open to what I have it down there, endpoint attack, right? Hack in through my thermostat or something like that. But you got malware, which probably everyone has heard of. The viruses, they've been around forever. Ransomware is a little bit newer. Everyone's seen the news stories. City gets hacked and they get ransomware and they got to pay millions of dollars to open it up, or a hospital, or that's going on. And Corey's going to talk more about that stuff. Phishing is my very favorite. Anyone here fallen victim to phishing yet? I have. I got hacked last summer. Really interestingly, my email is sending out emails, and then they put rules in Microsoft 365 to respond to every email that came in, move it over to the delete bucket, and then empty the delete bucket. So I didn't even know what was going on I was on vacation, coincidentally. I didn't know what was going on for like a week and a half. Didn't get an email hardly at all. I couldn't figure out why. But my team was leaving me alone. Wasn't the case. And then just kind of special asterisk there, the endpoint attacks on an IoT system, much more points to attack. Instead of one firewall at the front of my BAS system now, I've got potentially hundreds of devices that are talking, loosey-goosey on the wide open internet out there. And just in case you're thinking, well, there's so many, the spyware and the software to clean, all that kind of stuff is getting really smart. Well, guess what? The hackers are getting the same tools. They're much better about developing AI and machine learning, and they'll start something up and it's like click and forget, right? So if you think that we're getting smarter, well, they are too. So very non-discriminatory, and they use combinations of those to get to you, right? Phishing isn't an end to a means. Phishing is to get your credentials so that they can go do something else, right? So they combine these different types of attacks. So I'm running out. I need to leave Corey some time here, but prevention is key, right? And we've all heard the basics, and I've got some of it. All starts with the education. Physical access is a really important part of that. We know about proper use of technology and passwords and how to do get processes in place to do that. Proper networking design. I was listening earlier to somebody who was talking about just basic segregation. Somebody, I think it was in the BACnet thing, mentioned about segregate your TVs and things that are connected separately from your computer, or where you have QuickBooks or Quicken running on your home computer or whatever. So if they get in through a device like that, at least they're not getting that information. So there's really basic things that you can do. In our world, You know, it needs to be about device to cloud security. It can't be just, I've got the super secure cloud. Well, what about the data when it's getting there, right? When it's in transit? Is that encrypted? What about the end device down there? Can I hack into your gateway? Can I hack into your thermostat? How is that protected? Can I just do a basic denial of service attack on it and choke it up? So everything needs to be embedded and secure. And then, you know, the same thing, you've seen this circle 100 times before probably, but assess, plan, execute, reassess, make your adjustments. It's kind of a continuous process that you have to go through in that whole thing. And then finally, when it happens to you, it's not if it happens to you, because we will be part of a team or personally be hacked at some point in our life. Pretty much every expert that speaks on it says that will happen to pretty much everybody in some form or another. Like I said, my credit card's been compromised like a half a dozen times, one or the other over the past decade. My email was hacked, as I mentioned. But you need to know what you're going to do when an incident happens. How are you going to respond? How do you manage continuation of business for your client or for yourself? Have a plan in place. What happens if? You know, we used to worry. I used to back up everything onto disks back when. And then every night, somebody would go in and take the disk out. I'd take it home with me. So it was off site. So if my office burned down, I had everything I needed to open up somewhere else, right? And now the modern version of that, well, we'll store it to the cloud. You know, so there's some basic things that you can do for that. And then how do you recover? What's the disaster recovery plan? So having that in place up front, it's like everyone tells you, get a will, put a will in place, right? This is kind of the same thing. You've got to have some planning in place. I put in here, and we're going to publish these presentations after. I don't expect you to write all that down, but these are just some really good resources. NIST 800-53 seems to be sort of leading our industry, and it's really good guidelines on how to implement things, how to measure, how to do assessments. So, and then the SBA surprisingly has some really good resources on the basics of what you should be doing in there. So even DHS has free vulnerability scanning that you can. I've never tried it personally, but I heard about it and I went and checked it out. It looks kind of interesting. So some resources there for you. And then that's all I have for my part. So, all right, Corey's up. Sorry, I went longer. Yes. Yes. Maybe. Okay.
Please repeat the question so it's recorded.
Is there any kind of framework that's already developed this kind of tools? The second one is, since this is a kind of peer-to-peer communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not possible to have a kind of blockchain kind of technology to secure that part. Yeah. No.
Yes. Let me go to the, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Next one, right there. The answer to that simply, the simplest form is yes. Yes, yes. There are tools, there is framework. I don't think there is what I would call a de facto standard. You know, the whole thing that the BACnet SC group is working on is that's what they're trying to do, right? And it's not just, in the end, this is not going to be just about BACnet. This is going to be about control systems and architectures, right? It won't matter whether it's LAN or BACnet or Modbus or whatever's behind it. They're trying to figure out a way to put a protection layer in there. NIST is a great framework, and now a lot of enterprises are requiring NIST. And if you're going to sell into that enterprise, like we build panels, UL panels, and we have to adhere because our end user is a bank. Like you've got to have physical access control and security, and you got to document these things and have procedures. And so a lot of companies are starting to follow that. Blockchain has been interesting. I don't know a whole lot about it, but yeah, that sounds kind of interesting in doing that. We have the compute power to do that kind of stuff. So. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. I agree. I think it's safe to say that we haven't yet even seen the ultimate real solution to this. And it may never be a single bullet. You know, this is going to be a little bit of a shotgun approach. You're going to have to cover a lot of different areas. So, yeah, good question.
All right.
Thank you.
So thank you, Tracy. While we are switching here real quick, in fact, the snacks and drinks have already arrived.
That's the live mic.
Up there in the last few tables were in the corner, so if just a few people there wouldn't mind moving forward a little bit, that would be super. Thank you very much. The quicker you get
Can everyone hear me on this? Is that loud enough? Thanks. Thanks. I'll move through a bit of this. My name's Corey Gray. I'm also on the Longmark International Board. As you might be able to tell, I'm from Australia, although we have a lot of business here and in Europe and Asia. So there's some points here. I'm going to look at some more end user applications and I guess a few expansions on what Tracy just talked about. Quickly to your point on blockchain, one of the things with this already that people are looking a lot at is smart contracting with blockchain, so you can have device to device type transactions. As you know, a lot of the cybersecurity software is about finding out after you've been hacked who hacked you. That's kind of a bit late once they've run off with your wallet. So a lot of the innovation is about how to detect and prevent and then share information about attacks so that they can't get to multiple targets before that information's been shared. Traditionally, the problem if you're an IT manager is you don't want any device on your network because everyone's a point of failure. So at the moment, there's a lot of very nervous IT people around the world seeing all of these people want to connect more and more devices. And this is an extract from, we've talked about this NIST report before. I really think it's the seminal document in the world at the moment. The Department of Commerce here put together a very comprehensive report about 2 years ago that they've been building out. But this really describes the exact nature of the risk to building systems now in terms of cybersecurity. You know, when information technology started, you know, confidentiality was everything and then integrity and availability, but suddenly we have this industry that wants to build devices really quickly and make them available to everybody so you can buy them at a low price and quickly and connect them and make your own networks. But that brings with it the inherent challenge of cybersecurity for building systems and also smart city systems where we work a lot. And part of the importance of this, several clients we're working with at the moment have, you know, large projects in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and the constraint isn't the technology and its functionality and the value proposition of what it can do. It's the inherent level of risk associated with connecting that technology and that device into a common repository of data. Someone said to me recently in a design meeting in Europe, you know, why would somebody want to hack a smart rubbish bin? I said, because there's nothing to do with the bin. They want to get to your data. They want to steal personal data. You'll see up here that most of the data targets are things like hospitals where they've got social security numbers and addresses and names, and people can create false identities. And it's not necessarily about turning out the lights and turning on the sprinklers and all of the sort of original old die-hard stuff from however many years ago, although that's getting to become more and more possible. People want access to data. The other thing that's seen a surge in this industry to that point is the fact that insurers are now offering policies to pay ransoms. So that's not going to make hackers any less incentivized to keep hacking and to keep getting paid ransoms, and we cover some of them here. So this was another sort of salient statement about the state of cybersecurity and the Internet of Things. People have been happily connecting, and cybersecurity is like driving. We know that it's a dangerous thing to do and that people die driving every year in their thousands, but we decide to take a certain amount of risk. You know, you could make everything secure tomorrow and shut everything down and completely segregate everything and spend huge amounts of time keeping data isolated, but the value proposition of aggregating data and having analytics is significant. And so people price in a certain amount of risk to operating their businesses, the value of having a connected device and so forth. I've just put together here some quick screen and news grabs in case people aren't familiar with some of them. Last year, Texas, there were dozens of cities that were that were hacked. And one important thing to understand with this as cities are managing buildings is they're really, in the municipal context at least, going after organisations that have got money but don't have that big infrastructure to manage this cyber risk. You know, it's a quid pro quo. How much money have you got to manage risk? We're seeing it here. We're seeing it in Australia. You're seeing it here in Lake City. You know, these people are paying out through their insurers this sort of money because they're, in the next one you see that they ran their own water infrastructure, which was effectively held to ransom, right? So these cities have got, you know, 20,000 people, 50,000 people, not enough to have a full suite of cybersecurity people constantly operating in that space and providing 24/7 protection. You know, when Atlanta was hacked a few years ago, I'll just quickly, go through this one here. So this was all happening very quickly. All the Texas ones came together, the attacks in Florida came together. And that's why, again, to your point about having blockchain and the ability to quickly share similar attacks, some of these would have been prevented if that information could have been disseminated quicker.
We have this experience. I'm from Hollywood, actually, and a couple of months, one of the hospitals over there get a ransomware attack. They were asking for $250,000. So that is, they encrypt all information, they get all passwords, everything, and these security.
Yeah. Well, hospitals you'll see in some of the data at the end are obviously, like I say, some of the biggest targets of all because of the amount of personal data they keep to create alternative personalities and so on and so forth. So you go through some of these. Here's one where someone connected, you know, a fish tank thermometer, and that was the point of entry, right, for a cyber hack. So we can't be at the point anymore when people are designing building systems to say, you know, the second we want to bring all these systems together and have a common repository for control and data and analytics, we've got to have policies that come from the top down. So the way consultants design buildings is going to be incredibly important. Consultants who want to differentiate themselves in building services design will have to have knowledge of these things. You'll start to see your traditional AECOMs and these other firms have a cybersecurity vertical in their engineering services team to ensure that these sorts of things are managed. This is all the way back home where I live, but believe it or not, this government got hacked through a brute force attack where 1,975 people were all using password 123 to access the government database, right? So this is all about human behavior. This discussion really isn't about some brilliant piece of software that you can put on a device or some way that you can construct a network to protect itself permanently. Here's an example of a client that was hacked through an HVAC contractor who hadn't managed very well their processes and procedures with the client, and ultimately there was access via a malware into a store and obtain financial data, right? So it's not just about hitting up devices. I know a huge infrastructure IoT client at the moment and found out just recently as we were doing an audit that 3 separate subcontractors had access to the mainframe to turn all the lights off in a major city that we advise, just sitting on their computer. These are issues of human management and process. Now, obviously, people need to be able to maintain that asset, so they need access. But you, as a contractor or as an end client, have to have processes and procedures so that Jason can't have 2 beers on Sunday night and turn the lights off in Sydney. You know, these sorts of processes are far too common with building services because it's a bit easier for the person on site to give out the password, to give out the access. So a lot of it's about management. Now, a lot of you know all about this, some of these, but again, I mentioned it quickly on the way through. Here's a case of a process automation system being hacked in a steel mill. The whole thing shut down and destroyed the production facility in Germany. At huge expense to the client. It's not just about ransomware, you can also just have malicious attacks. There's different reasons to attack. You can have terrorists who just want to create disruption, governments who want to create political disruption, and then also people are looking for ransomware. And somewhere in there you'll have people selling cybersecurity software, I'm sure, that are deliberately trying to test how well it works so that people can get the next version of it. This is a really interesting case because British Airways and Marriott, you can see, received huge penalties there. You know, nearly 200 million US dollars and 350 million US dollars each. They were targeted in extremely sophisticated attacks, and now under the GDPR legislation in Europe, in the old days you'd get government sympathy, now you get a massive fine. They're saying you just have to protect data. And the people who are after this can equally come in, as I've said, through building system access, through subcontractor access. This is what they're after, this information. And everyone knows about this one, the largest one ever. So to describe a little bit further some of the consequences of these attacks, this, as I say, was a very notable attack. So there were a report in this audit for Atlanta of something like 900 separate breaches that were found in a security audit that were warned to the IT department in January that were non-actioned. So I assume someone's working somewhere else now, or a few people. They were attacked not long after. The recovery costs are huge, well, considerable, let's say. The inconvenience costs were massive, taking payments by check, manual payments, doing things by paper. Some of the things at the bottom, there were 10 years of police records and court records, 16 years of municipal records lost. You know, there were prosecutions that couldn't be made by cities because they'd lost all of their evidence to prosecute the case. So these are the sorts of commensurate costs outside of paying ransoms and outside of inconvenience to productivity that cybersecurity is bringing, and why it's becoming such a huge issue. In my country, we brought in some legislation 3 years ago. Interestingly, the first form of legislation like this was in California in, I think, 2001, and then there was nothing until Holland, or the Netherlands as they like to be known, only now in about 5 years ago. And there's been a steady move into this space now as people understand the need to protect data. Our fines are fairly modest compared to a $5 billion fine from the FTC, but this is a presentation we're talking about in different countries, so we include some different jurisdictions here. This is an interesting one in the US because even though this is European legislation, they have a provision called extraterritorial effect, which means even if you're an American operator with a European client and you leak their data, you are subject to their law, even if you're outside of the territory. And these are significant fines. You're talking 4% of global turnover. For different and separate breaches recently, Google have paid over 5 billion euros in fines now, which is fairly immaterial to balance sheet there, but there's significant penalties, and these are the different ways that you can assess the level of the breach and how they try and determine a fine. And this is the extraterritorial effects legislation, which, as I say, is important if you're multinationals and dealing with clients in different places. The FTC obviously here has a very broad remit, some of which includes cybersecurity, and you can see the level of incremental increase in fines that's been going on here as this becomes more and more of an issue and more of a target for hackers. This is part of the report that precedes the one that you referenced, and again, all of these will be available. This is, I think, an exceptionally well put together and thoroughly globally researched report for anybody wanting to know a lot about this space. There's some data here. If you multiply everything by 13, this data almost exactly represents American data. But you can see that human error is still 35% of all of the cause of cyber breaches. And as you bring trade services and systems online with other IT, with the traditional building services approach rather than an IT approach, we can expect to see that increasing. But the malicious attacks are going up and up and up. So yeah, you can imagine something in the order of 13,000 odd attacks here in a year, broken down, and this report's available, which is why I've included some of these. I'll move through them reasonably quickly. You've talked about phishing, but by far in terms of malicious attack, that's still the highest area or category. Human error breaches, people literally receiving emails. One thing I wanted to add is at the moment something called vishing, because there's always a new thing coming out. Has anyone across some of the vishing attacks, which is voice simulated software now? There was a case of somebody in London receiving an instruction from what they thought was their boss in Germany, who was really a cyber hacker who'd managed to replicate the voice of the superior and transferred out, I think, £150,000 to a bank account on what they thought was a voice instruction from their boss. So there's all these other more innovative ways to try and steal your money. You can see that the health sector at the bottom, as we talked about before, is by far the most targeted sector when it comes to people trying to steal information, followed by the financial sector. And then it slowly reduces down in direct correlation with how much personal data these people can access. But again, as I stress, in cybersecurity for building systems, the aim of the hacker mostly isn't to turn all the lights out and turn on the sprinklers. It's to get access to data, and by using a less secured device to get access to an aggregated data repository, that's really the name of the game. Or to create political disruption, as I've said before. This is an interesting one because it extrapolates out 894 breaches into the numbers of people who are affected by that breach. So you can see that 3 breaches affected over 3 million people just by themselves right at the top. So they are extremely inconvenient and pervasive. Again, there's a whole series of lists. What's interesting is if you now look at these policies of from insurance companies about how to take out cyber insurance, whether you're a designer or a contractor or an asset owner or operator, you've got to tick these boxes. Effectively, what they're forcing you to do is follow good process and policy and say, if you follow this process and policy, then I will insure your business. Several of these you talked about before, Tracy. Things like where you keep passports, regularly taking passwords, encryptions. Do you have regular training with staff? If you've got a bunch of tradespeople who work on systems, do you enforce to them the importance of changing passwords and not sharing security levels? You know, if one person's sick on a day on a building site and they share the password out to someone else because it's easier for them to keep doing the work, these types of things. And there's a whole bunch of other lists that the insurers go through. How much access to data do employees have in no particular order? Do you monitor intrusion? As I say, you can go through these. Disaster recovery plans are obviously important as well, to your point, Tracy, and a few other points here that we can go through. So going back to sort of the short circle and summary is, you know, contain, assess, take action, notify, and review. So this is a post-breach is the general mantra of all the people working in this space. And then the key areas in trying to prevent and control this is making sure that people are well trained. There are preventative technologies in place. You do have a disaster recovery team, just like you'd have a fire response team. Understand the possible consequences of breach, and then particularly in an area of commensurate fines now and downstream risk, make sure you communicate. In the past, it's tended to be fairly confidential who have had breaches and what those breaches are, because people didn't want to know they'd been breached because it's bad for their brand or it's bad for government. So that's a quick, I think, race through of hopefully the sort of correlation of why cybersecurity with network building systems and smart city systems, for that matter, is important, and the need for more awareness in this, that projects are going to be designed differently, where there's got to be, particularly if you're running buildings on dashboard, there's got to be an overlaying building dashboard that will end up talking to a city dashboard in the case of the Section 24 changes in the US, where the city, in California, where the city wants to be able to load shed through buildings, through interface devices. But a lot of it is just about processes and understanding the fact that this isn't going to stop, and as more and more devices come online, you get a much larger surface for potential for risk and attack. And the fact that there is money available now through insurance in such big numbers is just going to, I think, make it a lot more prevalent. Thank you. Yeah. The gentleman's got a question up here. Uh, yeah, so the question was how secure are cloud services? It's interesting that if we're doing a security review for one of our clients and you go to a vendor who uses cloud services for a system, you'll get a long list of things that come straight from the Amazon website or the Azure website or the IBM Watson or what have you. The short answer is they're all being hacked regularly. And it's a matter of, to your point, how you get the data into that cloud space is a big function of it. Once the data's in there, there are a whole bunch of things you can do to protect it. But if you're one of the cities we're working for, they might have 18 different systems all reporting or more into one cloud space, all through different APIs, all in different ways. So it's that end-to-end process that needs to be managed. Just saying I use Azure isn't enough. That's just once it's in the box, but you've still got to get it all the way from the factory to the box and then in the box and then lock the box and then it's safe. So in and of itself, you can make the data once it's in there very safe, but when you're having millions of transactions of data all the time in and out of that space, and many clients end up, not that they want it, but because people have built building systems and done deals with different telcos and different web services providers, they end up having their data in multiple different spaces, even if they're from the same company. Because the lighting people use Azure, but so do the smart parking people, and then the HVAC people use a different one. So you've got to have all this data running around, unless your IT people have been involved in the design at the beginning, sharing data constantly. So the complexity is getting in and out all the time. Yes. Well, the one I talked about with Atlanta, 2 Iranians were have been charged, and I mean the fines and penalties are quite significant now in this disruption. Like I said, you're even seeing it in terms of whichever side of the coin you fall on, political influence through social media and all of these sorts of things. Everyone's upping the stakes, I guess, when it comes to penalties. But at the end of the day, you're still seeing the best hackers being recruited by the biggest governments to be on their side at the end of it. There's this sort of logic of pragmatism around this industry that everyone wants somebody who knows more about it than somebody else. So you're actually seeing these people seconded into positions to help work or advise on how to be on the other side of what they were doing. So in short, penalties are going up. A lot of them are hard to prosecute because you've got, Russian-sponsored hackers a lot, Chinese government doing a lot, occasionally domestic people hacking, but it's very hard to find that person when they're using multi-routed approaches and very broad attack methodologies to locate those people and then bring them into a jurisdiction to bring them to justice. That's one of the big challenges.
That's kind of my point. Right?
Yeah, I see it like a football game. If I were allowed to go out there and I don't have to play by the rules, but you do have to play by the rules, you're at a disadvantage. And I think there's going to be this perpetuating cycle where they don't have to play by the rules. They make new rules all the time and then break them. So we're always going to be chasing this. There's no silver bullet for this to solve the problem. It's just going to be an endless process of trying to keep up. And that's why sharing information quicker, if 3 sites receive the same malware attack, let's say within an hour, that everyone else is notified and there's people working on that already to understand. We've seen a great response with this coronavirus, right? The information sharing, shutting down airports, that's the sort of response that you need in real time for cybersecurity with information sharing and interventive action. And so it's all about, again, changing policies and approach and strategy is going to be the biggest benefit here, because people are going to keep making new ways to hack and new viruses, and it's never going to end. It's going to get a lot more expensive to business to manage, because the insurance companies aren't going to give you money for nothing. So that cost is going to go up, and it's going to be a very long process. So.
One of the inherent issues in the commercial space is you've got the IT people on this side of the building, you've got facilities people here. Now we're going to come down to work together.
It's like a high school dance, isn't it? We spend a lot of time with organisation change management with companies to deal with exactly that issue. If they want technology confluence, if they want data aggregation, if they want data sharing, the people need to get along. And I said yesterday, I sat with one city recently and had 23 senior executives there, and 18 of them didn't know each other, even though they worked in the same building. You know, it's crazy. Project team managers, facility managers, IT people, marketing and communications, and on and on and on. And believe it or not, marketing and comms is hugely important because you've got to get a message out to your people, to your client, all different people. So you've got to get them in a room. It's people dealing with people. It's really the first principle of being alive is how to get along with people and work together for a common outcome. And breaking down the silos is very, very important.
It has to go that way. And, you know, it's interesting when I prepare presentations, I'll go back over the years and look at old things. And not this year, but last year I was looking at a presentation we did in 1999, talking about that problem exactly. And our point of advice that we said 20 years ago is still true today, which is if you're a facilities person or IoT, if you want to call it, you have got to get the IT people into the project and planning early as you possibly can. Don't show up when you're all installed and integrated and ready to go and say, okay, I need 64 dedicated IP addresses. And by the way, we're going to be DHCP and everything over here. So it's the Wild West on, you know, point-to-point security. It's not going to happen. No, and then the IT people have other problems that they get to deal with, right? You're going to put how many gigabytes of data through my network? You know, so they've got a lot of other issues. So you got to get involvement from both sides really early in the project.
We saw a case of a city where the engineering people had engaged our firm to design a solution. I kept saying, can we get the IT people, the legal people, and the procurement to the meeting? And like, why? We're engineers. We don't. At the end of a year, they'd spent a fortune of money, and they finally got these people into the room. And I said to the IT guy, are we allowed to connect this to your network? And he said, not in a million years. And I said to the procurement guy, can you buy this software as a service model? And he said, no. And they just, that was it. Like, but for a year we were saying, you've got to get these guys in the room. There was another question over here before, I thought. Otherwise, yes.